A snowstorm descended upon the mountain as the owner, with his 2 German shepherds and their puppies, reached the summit. They were ready for an adventure, but the mountains, like nature itself, never forgive carelessness. In the blink of an eye, everything went wrong. Strong winds, a blizzard, and soon the dogs vanished, their tracks lost in the snowdrifts. Left searching for each other, they began to fight for survival, and fate turned so that the male dog decided on the final step, heading into the icy void. His heart raced and his steps grew weaker. Meanwhile, someone in the distance could have been their only hope. But who? The mighty mountains, covered with a blanket of snow, appeared majestic and mysterious. From their peaks, one could see the world in all its beauty, and it was to these peaks that the man, with his loyal companions, 2 German shepherds, Hermann and Leah, and their puppies, set off on their long-awaited journey. It was morning, and the sky was cloudless like crystal, the air fresh, and the snow sparkled like countless diamonds scattered across the ground. It was the perfect day for a mountain adventure, a place where the feeling of freedom and vastness filled the soul. The owner was an experienced and knowledgeable man. He knew how to guide his dogs, how to read nature, and understand its signs. The dogs and puppies were also ready for the journey, which promised to be exciting and captivating. Hermann, the older dog, always confident in himself and his strength, had been the owner's loyal companion for a long time, while Leah, his young and energetic partner, always followed the older dogs. The puppies, their small fur balls, moved with incredible playfulness until they realized that the journey, although exciting, would require much more effort than they had thought. Before heading out, the owner carefully inspected his pets. He checked their collars, made sure that everything necessary for the trip was in his backpack. Inside, he had a thermos with hot tea, several sandwiches for a snack, and light blankets for the dogs to wrap themselves in if they felt cold. He also packed spare gloves and a hat just in case, though he didn't expect the weather to change rapidly. They walked for a long time, but not in a hurry. The silence around them was only disturbed by their steps and the soft breathing of the dogs. The ground beneath their feet was firm, and the snow lay in smooth layers, like something out of a fairy tale. Nature was truly alive, and the owner felt a part of this great and boundless world. The puppies ran around, sometimes falling behind the parents, playing in the snow, chasing each other, but always trying to catch up with their older siblings. Hermann and Leah walked side by side, not rushing, but carefully watching every movement, every step of the owner. Soon they came upon a trail that led to higher parts of the mountain. The wind had become slightly colder, but for the man and the dogs it was not an obstacle. On the contrary, the owner felt how good it was to breathe at such heights. The weather was perfect for hiking. The wind blew against their faces, but it did not bring excessive cold. Everything felt like a fairy tale, the world frozen, and even the most distant snow-covered mountain peaks seemed close, as though they were within reach. The dogs were delighted. Leah, curious and playful, often lagged behind the main group, trying to catch snowflakes, jumping through the snow with laughter. Hermann, on the other hand, moved more confidently as though he knew that in the mountain landscapes every step could be decisive. The puppies, with undisguised joy, ran behind them, filling the air with cheerful barks. This was a sign for the owner that everything was going as it should. But just a couple of hours later, when they started ascending even higher, came the moment when everything changed. First, it was barely noticeable changes in the air, a slight chill that gradually became more noticeable. The wind grew stronger but was still restrained. Clouds were already gathering at the peak, dark like parchment, hiding the light. The owner did not pay much attention to it, knowing that the mountains, like nature itself, are subject to change. He continued walking, slowly, keeping an eye on his pets who appeared calm, though somewhat alert. At one point, they stopped to take a break. Hermann lifted his head, and Leah crouched in the snow, sniffing the air. The puppies, noticing this, also stopped and turned to their older companions waiting for instructions. The owner took a moment, looked around, and felt the atmosphere changing. He saw how the clouds were suddenly thickening, and the light became dim, as if the day itself decided to end earlier than expected. It was the moment when a person instinctively feels that the weather is about to change, and caution is needed. Nothing to worry about, the owner thought, picking up his backpack and checking that all his gear was in order. He was confident that he could handle any bad weather that might come. However, before he could finish his thoughts, a strong gust of wind broke the silence. The cold wind surged into their space, and with it, the first snowflakes began to fall. The snow was not like usual. It was dense, quickly covering the ground, and soon the dogs began to lose their tracks in the snow. The wind, as though from a dream, would sometimes grow so strong that it felt as though the world around them was disappearing. The owner turned around and saw how the snow clouds were swallowing the sky, and he realized it was time to move on. They continued, but now with caution. The puppies, not understanding what was happening, kept running around happily, but soon their playfulness gave way to alertness. The dogs, watching their owner, began to move slower, their steps becoming more cautious, but they kept following him. At that moment, Herman looked into his owner's eyes as if to say, "This is not just snow." The owner felt the unease but still believed that everything would be fine, and so they continued, absorbed by the snowstorm, which showed no sign of calming down. Every step became harder, but they kept going, not knowing that ahead of them awaited the most dangerous trials. When they reached the summit, it seemed that the world had grown even quieter. The snow that had been falling from the sky was no longer light flakes, as it had been at the beginning of the journey. It had become heavy and dense, and the wind had intensified, cutting through any attempt to find shelter with its cold blades. The owner felt the air become sharper, his breathing growing heavy, and his eyes stung from the piercing wind. But he could not stop. He knew that they had to keep moving, not wasting any time. The dogs, Herman and Leah, as well as the puppies, sensed this change. At first they slowed down as though feeling the growing threat. Herman, the older and more experienced one, slightly reduced his speed, clearly feeling that something was wrong. Leah also became more cautious, glancing back at the owner as if trying to understand what was happening. The puppies behaved as usual, running around, playing in the snow, unaware that a blizzard was approaching around them. The owner noticed that the snow was beginning to pile in dense layers, and visibility was growing worse. Everything was happening so quickly that, at some point, he could not tell where the road ended and the snowy void began. The wind became stronger, blocking both the sky and the ground, and soon each step, each breath became more difficult. Noticing this, the owner decided it was time to turn back. But despite this, he couldn't help but feel how nature, with its power and tyranny, was beginning to take control. He raised his hand to get the dog's attention, but when he turned around, he realized they were gone. The wind, like a massive wall, had blocked everything around them, and the snowflakes filled the space, turning into tiny white dots, disappearing into the endless expanse. All that remained was the solitary silhouette of the owner in the blizzard, trying to understand what had happened. He looked around, feeling panic rising inside him. Where were his faithful companions? Where were his dogs? He started walking in the direction where the last traces had disappeared, but soon realized it was hopeless. He tried calling them, but his voice drowned in the cold, biting wind that left no room for sound. The dogs couldn't hear him. Was Herman looking for him? Or perhaps Leah and the puppies were still nearby? He didn't know. The feeling that they might have gotten lost in this snowy void became threatening. He knew that if he didn't find them soon, the consequences could be catastrophic. The owner realized he couldn't continue searching in these conditions. He stopped, feeling the cold penetrate to his very bones. The noisy wind sometimes blocked his breath, and the snowdrifts hindered his ability to navigate. He grabbed his backpack again and decided to head back to shelter. However, on the way back, it seemed that in these mountains there would be neither shelter nor salvation. Everything was becoming one vast white space, devoid of any landmarks. Herman and Leah, lost in this snowy ocean, tried to find each other. Their sense of smell weakened under the pressure of the wind, and they could no longer trust their instincts. The dogs tried to find their way, but the blizzard blocked everything. Leah, lacking experience in such conditions, followed Herman, who, despite his confidence, was unable to calm his growing anxiety. He led her, but he stopped more and more often, not understanding where they were. The puppies became restless. Their fur began to freeze with frost, and their little paws froze from the intense cold. They couldn't understand what was happening, feeling neither their strength nor their footing in this world that had suddenly become so harsh and hostile. Herman, realizing that they were losing time, led them to a small sheltered area, protected from the wind by large rocks. It was the only place where they could hide from the blizzard, even if just a little. Leah lay down in the snow, carefully watching over her puppies, but Herman knew they couldn't stay here long. He couldn't let them freeze. Seeing how the cold was creeping into their bodies only made his resolve stronger. Herman understood that the only chance to save them was to find help. He left his family in shelter, hiding them from the storm, and set out to find a path, knowing it would be incredibly difficult. He walked, feeling his body weakening with each step. The snow increasingly covered the ground and the wind grew even more terrifying. He moved slowly, feeling each cell of his body as if it was beginning to betray him. Herman was tired, but he kept going, and his only guide was the last glimpse of his family. He felt that he had to survive for them, and that he couldn't leave them behind. But the cold became so intense that his thoughts began to blur. His paws barely felt the ground, and with every step, his breathing became heavier. After a while, he realized that his strength was running out. He slowed down and, barely standing on his paws, stopped to catch his breath. In his eyes, there was no longer the confident look that had been there at the beginning of the journey. It was the look of an exhausted and desperate dog, one that had to continue the fight despite everything. Herman still believed that salvation was somewhere near, that he could find help, and then, at the moment when his strength was nearly gone and he thought he could go no further, his attention was drawn to a small cabin in the distance. He saw it, barely distinguishing its outline against the blizzard, but it was enough for his steps to become more determined. He headed towards it, hoping for one last chance. Herman walked through the snow, which now seemed like an insurmountable barrier, hiding all landmarks. Every step became heavier, and his paws sank into the snow, leaving deep tracks that were instantly covered by a new layer. With each passing moment, his strength waned, but the thought of leaving his family behind in shelter haunted him. He knew he had to return for them, that he couldn't afford to make a mistake, but every effort became more and more difficult. His breathing was heavy, and his gaze grew dim, losing clarity from the wind that rushed down the mountain peaks and struck him like an unrelenting torrent. The wind battered his body, penetrating even his strongest bones. Herman tried to keep his balance, but he had to stop to catch his breath. Every movement became slower, as if nature itself was trying to stop him. He wasn't just tired. He felt his body refusing to move forward, as if it was betraying him. The snow, which had once been light and soft, had now become hard and slippery, and each step sent a sharp pain through his legs. But despite this, his mind still pushed him forward, despite the exhaustion and pain. Huge snowflakes fell from the sky, obscuring everything around them, creating a complete void, with nothing but a white ocean of snow and cold. Visibility was almost zero, and Herman could not even see anything just a few meters ahead. He didn't know where he was, and this unknown world seemed alien and hostile to him. He kept moving, feeling how his paws slipped more often, and his body refused to move any further. But the thoughts of Leah and the puppies kept him going. A long time passed, and Herman began losing track of time. He didn't know how many hours had passed, but it felt like time had frozen, just like the world around him. The snow continued to fall, and the wind became even fiercer, as if it knew that no one should survive on this mountain. Every moment felt like the last, and every step was a monumental effort. He was close to giving up, but his instincts wouldn't let him. His thoughts were clear. He couldn't leave his family. At that moment, barely holding on to consciousness, Herman noticed a faint glow in the distance. He froze, listening. It was something unusual, completely out of character for this blizzard. Perhaps it was a cabin, perhaps salvation, but he couldn't afford to doubt. He gathered all the strength he had left in his body and took a few steps toward the light, despite the overwhelming weight of his condition. His paws were buckling, but he kept going. When Herman reached the reflective windows of the cabin, his body was on the verge of collapse. He felt his strength fading, and his breath became shallow. His eyes clouded with exhaustion, but there was still that small beam of hope he had seen in the darkness of the blizzard. He reached the door and, feeling that he could no longer move, jumped on it with all his might, trying to attract attention. His final push was so strong that the cabin shook. He began barking, his voice sounding like a faint echo in the storm. But it was all he could do. Herman kept barking, knowing that this was his only chance. He didn't know who was inside the cabin, but he was willing to do anything to get their attention. The wind didn't stop, but he knew that if he didn't do this, he wouldn't see his family again. Barking, despite the fatigue and cold, he felt the warm light from the window surrounding him. His whole body trembled, but the hope for salvation did not fade. He kept barking again and again, resting occasionally but continuing to force out the last sound from his body. He knew that if no one responded, it would all be lost. But suddenly, in that silence, which felt like an eternity, he heard footsteps inside the cabin. After a few minutes, the cabin door opened. A tall, strong man, dressed warmly, stood in the doorway and looked at Herman, who could barely stand on his paws. His breathing was labored and steam escaped from his mouth. The man noticed how the dog was barely holding himself up and quickly ran to him, helping him into the house. Herman barely made it over the threshold before his body allowed him to sit on the floor, feeling the intense warmth filling him. The man, who lived in the cabin, carefully covered the dog and quickly took action. He gave Herman warm food, and at that moment, the dog began to feel his strength returning. But there was no peace in the man's eyes. He understood that he needed to find the rest of the family. Herman gave his request by going to the door and gazing into the darkness beyond. The man, noticing this, understood that his help would now be crucial for saving the dog's whole family. The man prepared himself, and as soon as the snow began to quiet down, Herman led him back to the shelter where Leah and the puppies remained. All this time, he had believed that he could not leave his family, and this was exactly what drove him to keep moving forward despite all the threats from nature. Meanwhile, in the shelter, Leah and the puppies, saved from the blizzard, were in a safe but dangerous state. Although Leah was young, she understood the gravity of the situation. She lay next to the puppies, trying to shield them with her body from the cold wind that seeped through the cracks in the snow. Their small bodies trembled from the cold, and Leah, despite her anxiety, did not allow herself to panic. She felt her responsibility for them. Her only goal was to keep them alive. The puppies, in turn, did not understand the full extent of the threat hanging over them. They continued to howl and make noises, trying to break the silence and the cold. Leah quietly tried to calm them down, pulling them close. It was not easy. Their fur was covered in frost, and despite her warm body, the cold still penetrated their small bones. In moments like this, even a mother's instinct couldn't always cope with the relentless cold of the mountain blizzard. In this emptiness, where there were no visible paths or possibilities for rescue, Leah looked toward the direction from which they had come. Herman had left them here, and now she was the only one who had to protect her pups. But even her strong character couldn't shake the anxiety and worry. She knew Herman wouldn't leave her, but what if he didn't return? What if, despite all his efforts, he couldn't find them or didn't survive the harsh winter? The puppies gradually fell silent, pressing against her. Leah looked at them and felt their warmth transferred to her, and although she was tired and gripped by fear, she felt how this gave her strength. They couldn't stay there forever, but as long as it was dark and the storm raged outside, she knew that the only thing left was to survive until morning. The hours stretched slowly. Leah closed her eyes, trying to sleep, but the worry wouldn't leave her. She couldn't forget how quickly the dark storm had engulfed them and how Herman had disappeared into the white void. She tried to mentally push these thoughts away, knowing that panic could consume her. With every gust of wind that came through the cracks in the shelter, Leah kept raising her head, as if listening for some invisible signs, for footsteps that might bring salvation. Meanwhile, Herman continued his path to salvation. After nearly exhausting all his strength, he finally reached the cabin. Upon crossing the threshold, his life began to fill with light again, and he felt his body revive from the warm air and food. The man living in the cabin tended to him, and Herman felt relief, as though his soul had finally relaxed after such a long time. But despite all the care, his mind was not at ease. He had to return to Leah and the puppies. This moment was crucial. The man from the cabin, noticing the dog's desire to return, understood that his help would be necessary. Encouraged by the man's attention, Herman got up on his paws and stood by the door, barking, indicating the way. The man quickly realized that the dog could not return without help, so he gathered his gear. The wind outside still didn't subside, and although the raging storm still held the mountain in its grip, the man was determined. He warmed the dog and set off with him back into the void where Leah and the puppies remained. They knew that their main task now was to find a place where they could wait out the storm. The road led them back, step by step, through miles of snowdrifts and almost zero visibility. Herman led the man as best he could, stopping only to rest but never allowing himself to stand still for long. He knew that his beloved Leah and their puppies were still in the shelter, and he could not let them down. The man carefully followed the dog and could see how Herman pressed forward, ignoring his exhaustion. The same survival instinct that had helped him stay alive didn't let him give up. They moved through the blizzard, as if cutting a path through the elemental forces of nature itself. After several hours of battling the storm, when it seemed that the chances of a successful return were zero, Herman climbed another hill, and down below, through the snow, a shelter flickered. He recognized the place. His heart began to race again, and his paws carried him forward despite the fatigue. The man, following him, also felt the approaching salvation. When they reached the shelter, Leah, sensing the approach of her partner, raised her head and instantly recognized him. She got up, barely able to do so, and met his gaze, full of worry and relief. The dogs and puppies were together again, and the warm light of the cabin not only warmed their bodies but also brought hope for the future. The man from the cabin, realizing that now was not the time for long conversations, covered them with warm blankets and quickly prepared food for everyone. Leah and the puppies began to calm down, feeling the safety and protection. Herman, exhausted but content to be reunited with his family, tiredly sank to the ground. He knew the storm wouldn't end immediately, but for now, in this shelter, they were all safe. However, deep inside, Herman still felt anxiety. What if their owner couldn't find them in time? What if the storm didn't leave so quickly? But in that moment, pressed against Leah and the puppies, he felt that irreplaceable bond that gave him the strength to survive this nightmare and continue the fight for life. The cabin that Herman led the man to became a temporary refuge, a shelter that offered the dogs and their owner a break from the fierce storm. Inside, it was warm, and the fire in the stove, burning with weak but steady flames, illuminated the space and gave hope. The man, noticing how heavily the dogs were suffering from the blizzard, immediately took measures to support them during this difficult time. He made them a warm corner, laying out blankets and doing everything he could to create a comfortable environment for the animals. Herman, seeing all this, finally allowed himself to relax. However, his mind was still troubled by a sense of unease. He knew that his family and his owner needed him, that their lives depended on how quickly they could get out of this snowy hell. Everything around them was different from usual. While Leah and the puppies rested in the warmth, Herman kept looking out the window where the storm continued to rage outside the cabin. He lacked confidence, and he felt that time was not on their side. The man from the cabin, noticing his anxiety, calmly approached the dog and sat beside him. He covered him with a warm blanket and gently tried to soothe him with a soft touch. In his eyes there was care, but also an understanding that their journey was not over, and the storm had not calmed down. This experience was not new to him. He had lived here for many years, in these mountains, and he knew that such storms could last for days, sometimes even weeks. But on the other hand, he also knew that there must be ways out, even if they were hidden beneath the terrible blanket of snow. Herman, feeling the warmth, finally allowed himself to relax a bit, but his thoughts still didn't let go. He kept thinking about Leah, about the puppies, and about their owner, who might still not be safe. He started to believe that even if the storm didn't subside, they would need to leave the cabin to find their way home. Not only for them, but also for the man who was their friend and protector. At that moment, the man stood up and grabbed his winter clothes. He quickly checked his gear, then headed to the door, ready to go out and explore the snowdrifts, trying to understand what was happening with the weather. Herman stood up, walked over to the door, and began barking, signaling that he wanted to accompany him. The man noticed his attempts and stopped. He sighed, realizing that the dog was ready to help and would not allow himself to stay on the sidelines. "You want to go with me?" the man asked, as if it could change the decision. But Herman had no doubts. He was ready. He knew that if he didn't take action now, the chances for rescue might run out. The man, in turn, agreed with his determination. He understood that if Herman didn't calm down and wasn't given the chance to do what his heart demanded, they wouldn't be able to continue. The man and Herman stepped out into the blizzard. The wind was so strong that it felt like every snowflake was hitting their face, burning their skin. Nevertheless, Herman didn't stop, and the man followed him. It was not only a test for the body, but also for the spirit. Every step was swallowed by the white drifts, and there were no landmarks in the darkness. But still the dog, despite the exhaustion and tension, led them forward. He knew that their salvation would depend on whether they could endure all the trials of this storm. They moved hour by hour, but after some time, Herman, seeing a familiar place, joyfully ran ahead. He knew he had to bring his owner back. He knew he couldn't leave him in this snowy hell. He felt how each step became lighter and his breathing calmer. At one point, they reached the shelter, which was so familiar to him. With the man's help, they made their way through the snowdrifts and reached the place where Leah and the puppies had taken refuge from the storm. Leah raised her head, instantly recognizing Herman, and pressed the puppies closer so they wouldn't feel the cold. The puppies, curiously, not understanding what was going on, ran to their father, barking happily, but their joy was subdued, as if they sensed that the storm was not over yet. The man, inspecting the shelter, decided they should rest for a while. He brought in some items that could help them warm up, then closed the door again and locked the cabin. The fire in the stove began to burn brighter, and the air once again filled with warmth. But despite the fact that they were all safe, Herman could not stop feeling anxious. He knew that after this rescue, there was still a long way to go home, and the storm might not end quickly. But at that moment, he was able to relax a bit. His family was nearby, and the help they had received was exactly what they needed to recover. And while it was warm and safe, they could rest and regain their strength for the next stage of their journey. But Herman still couldn't stop thinking that they had to continue this journey, despite all the dangers that awaited them in the blizzard. The weather gradually calmed, but the cold still penetrated every crack. Herman, Leah, and the puppies, resting in the shelter, began to feel some relief. The sky gradually cleared, and on the horizon, the faint rays of the sun started to break through the remnants of mist and snow clouds. However, despite the improving weather, Herman's internal unease did not leave him. His mind still lingered on home, on the owner who might be far away, and on the fact that they all needed to return to their familiar life. The cabin where they had waited out the storm had given them the strength they needed, but Hermann knew they couldn't stay there for long. Time was passing, and although the blizzard was subsiding, the skies remained low and threatening. The man from the cabin, carefully watching the condition of everyone, made the decision that they needed to set out while the snow had not yet started to accumulate again. He suggested that the dogs rest a little more, and after gathering everything they needed, he went to the door. Hermann, for his part, moved first, as if guided not only by instincts, but by an inner sense of duty. The man and the dogs left the cabin, and as soon as the door closed behind them, they found themselves in a world that now seemed completely foreign. The snow had not melted, and everywhere stood white, almost impenetrable barricades. Hermann noticed how the snow, which had been light and almost playful at the beginning of their journey, had now become heavy and burdensome, as if all the forces of nature were battling with it. Everything around them, seemingly frozen in anticipation, stretched out to the horizon, where in the empty silence there was not a single sound. Step by step they moved along the snow-covered trail that led down from the cabin. Hermann walked, feeling how his paws started to ache from the cold, and each breath was filled with an unbearable chill. However, he couldn't allow himself to stop. He knew the way home lay through these mountains, and their salvation depended on how far they could go. The man moved alongside him, in the same silence, almost not paying attention to his companions. The snow under his feet crunched, and only the sound of their steps disturbed the stillness. Hermann didn't know what would have happened without this man, without his help. He was grateful, but his mind still held on to the thought that they had to keep going as far as they could, despite everything. The path became harder, and the snow began to slow their movement again. Hermann, leading the way, started moving more slowly, trying to choose the firmest patches of ground to avoid sinking into the deep snow. Leah and the puppies followed him, leaving their small tracks next to his large ones. Despite their exhaustion, the dogs stayed together, understanding that now not only physical strength was important, but also mutual support. They walked on the difficult path for several hours. Time passed unnoticed, and gradually the landscape around them began to change. The snow became less dense, and finally, familiar outlines began to appear on the horizon. Hermann, as if feeling this, slowed his pace and then stopped, looking ahead. The man, following him, also stopped and carefully surveyed the surroundings. "We're close," thought Hermann, despite all the fatigue that hadn't left him. He felt that they were near home, near familiar places where his owner might be waiting for him. And although the storm had subsided and the path had opened up, Hermann knew that they still had a long way to go. But now he was no longer afraid. He was sure they could make it. Meanwhile, Leah and the puppies, tired from the long journey, also felt that the atmosphere was changing. The dogs, seeing how their parents and the owner were beginning to show more energy, felt a surge of strength as well. The puppies sped up a little, playfully darting between their parents and shaking their heads from the cold. Leah, following Hermann, kept watching him, understanding that despite the exhaustion, he would not allow himself to give up. Finally, they reached the end of the route, and ahead, the outlines of a human dwelling began to appear. Hermann felt a lightness in his soul. This was a place he knew. With joy, he realized they had reached their destination. But there was one more challenge that required their attention. Gathering their strength, they headed towards the house. It was familiar and warm, just like many moments from the past. When they reached the door, Hermann happily realized that this would once again be his home, where the owner and his family would be safe. When the man knocked on the door, footsteps were heard from inside. A moment later, the door opened and they found themselves inside the house. Leah and the puppies eagerly rushed in, where they were immediately covered with warm blankets, and the owner, smiling, exclaimed, "You're back!" Hermann lay down on the warm floor, his body no longer feeling the pain of the cold. He was safe, surrounded by his family, and understood that this journey, full of fears and trials, had not been in vain. The storm was behind them, and now they could rest, regain their strength, and begin the next phase of their lives.